I'd like to introduce Patsy West, who is a historian for the Seminole tribe, and she's here to tell us the history of the Seminoles in South Florida.
Actually, just a correction so I don't get in trouble. I'm not the historian for the Seminole tribe. There really isn't one, but I have been writing Seminole history for almost 50 years, and my family has been with the Seminoles since 1887. So, and actually when I say Seminoles, that's incorrect because really these are the Miccosukee people, not the Miccosukee tribe, but everybody that you would know probably that was, quote, a Seminole really is a speaker or was a speaker of Miccosukee. So this is a completely different group of people who we have always known, but they are not really Seminole. They actually have a true identity since 1540, and that is their language, which is Miccosukee. And we have a very famous lady in the audience today. I don't know if you've seen this, but she's sitting right there. This is very, very important here. Elsie Johns, Miss J.
Yeah, Elsie.
Okay. This is sort of a difficult juggle here, so I will do my very best. Can you take, yeah, thank you. I just need to juggle this. Anyway, I'll make this as quiet as possible, but I've got a lot to say, and it's easier if I've got notes so that I don't go all over the place with it. We can go faster this way. These are my good friends, my Miccosukee Bobby Henry, who makes it rain, the rainmaker, with Alan and Blue Jay Jumper at Smallwood Store in Chokoloskee in 1992. Has anybody been over to Chokoloskee? Yeah, oh good. You should go over there as just run across the trail or the alley and go over to Chokoloskee sometime for a get-together, because it's really different and lovely and was like it was back in the early 1900s. Again, I've been with the Miccosukee people for over 45 years and my family since 1887. In my ethnohistorical work, I've concentrated on the interpretation of the Miccosukee through the continuance of their traditions, such as their town names, which were historically passed down. And I'm talking back in the early 1800s. I mean, before that, but that's where the history really starts because people were making documented records. Their town names, which were historically passed down so you can track them by the names, and their numerous profound traditions, such as carrying the fire to a new town or even a temporary location. I have, for instance, documented the fire continuing to be carried by Miccosukee families from place to place during my great-grandfather's day. So it was still carried from place to place when the Miccosukee were coming into the tourist attractions in Miami. If you've got your clan fire with your home, that's all it takes, just carrying your fire. The Miccosukee were documented by Hernando de Soto in 1540, and they were living at that time in Greater Peninsula, Florida, in today's southwestern Georgia. While America's generic tribal designation deemed the Miccosukee as highly contentious of the Seminole protagonists during the 50 years of the Seminole Wars, they were fighting to remain in Florida, they were fighting to protect their land, and those people today represent 70% of the total of the Indian population in Florida. The greater picture of Florida's Indian history is that everything we know, and sometimes know even incorrectly, is about Miccosukee history. This NASA image depicts the land that was sacred to the Miccosukee, so sacred to them, in fact, that they would rather die than be removed from it. Indeed, the Miccosukee call this land Echinacea. And echinacea is part of every Miccosukee's body. It's part of your hand. If you point your finger and you drop your thumb, this is Florida. And this was a sign for Florida. And people today still remember that. That's very profound, right? I found that at the end of my research, not at the beginning. At the time the Spanish explorer, De Soto, marched from Tampa Bay north, The peoples who would later become known as the Miccosukee were residents within the Greater Peninsula landmass of Florida, in the town of Cabbage, located today in southwestern Florida. And it's in a watery ecosystem. It's not unlike the Florida Everglades at all. It's very, very similar. And DeSoto chronicled the town, the people's attitude, and most importantly, their unique language as, quote, unintelligible to those around them. Now, when you stop and think about that, that is very significant because that is their marker. That's who marks them as Miccosukee, is their language. And that set apart the Miccosukee from anybody else, and that's what I did. I kept going back farther and farther and finding those same people with that same language, and no other scholar had ever bothered to do that. So I did that for my family, for the people, and it's been a good deal because it's been a great ride. Sometime later, a group of Capechequians journeyed southwest to the confluence of the Capechequi, today's Flint River. We all know the Flint River and the Chattahoochee rivers. They come together. A historic Miccosukee settlement existed there by the latter 18th century. These people were given the name Miccosukee by their hometown based on one of their stories about the new land. The Miccosukee call themselves Ilaposhnichati, people who speak, and their language Ilabongi. By the mid-1700s, the largest Miccosukee town was located east of present-day Tallahassee. This proactive red town was the largest settlement in the entirety of Florida. The Miccosukee dealt with the Spanish there. They allied with the British in 1776, 1812, and 1814 against the Americans. Leading the Miccosukee in the latter 1700s and the first 2 decades of the 19th century were old Capechimiko and his heir Capechimiko Kanaji. Their names were honorary titles that provide a naming DNA that reflected back to their ancestral town of Capechequi and by the time of the First Seminole War in 1817, with the Miccosukees being the aggressive, proactive, with a grand reputation thereof, the council gave the Miccosukee leadership of the Indians of Florida in the conflict against the Americans, who would ultimately, in the name of manifest destiny, want the Indians that they called Seminoles removed from Florida, because they really did believe in the sea to shining sea, and that's what they wanted, was no impediment in their way. And that's why they started that move to move Indians onto reservations. As a result of the First Seminole War, 1816 to 1817, in the aftermath of the American siege and resultant devastation of Miccosukee and all other Indian settlements in uplands Florida, it was Capechequi Kanaji who, armed with a British proclamation saved from his people's service to England in 1814 that promised British commitment to their Indian allies in the future, the Indian Council decided that Kanaji should journey south from upland Florida to seek English aid in Nassau or even in Jamaica. And what this is, satellite imagery, but we knew it before as the tongue of the ocean. So this is between our coast and Nassau, the tongue of the ocean. It's kind of scary to me. I've traveled it before, but I didn't see it like this. like it's going to eat you if you go that way. And that is the Devil's Triangle, by the way. So, you know, it's not too far-fetched. At Port Tavernier in the Florida Keys, Kanaji boarded a wrecking vessel with 28 of his chiefs, unfortunately unidentified. Sam Jones could have been one of them, we just don't know, and sailed across the tongue of the ocean to New Providence, Nassau. But unfortunately, since England had been most thoroughly defeated by her colonies, she was not politically in a position to assist further in supporting her former allies. However, in a gesture of goodwill, the governor of the Bahamas, the Honorable William Versey Munnings, sent the Miccosukee contingency back to Florida loaded with literally tons of supplies and coin, specie. But what were they supposed to do? They had no place to go. So my research strongly suggests that they entered the Everglades through Upper Biscayne Bay and settled on the high islands in the interior, which they doubtless knew very well. They had been down there before from seasonal settlement patterns in today's North Miami. Location, location, location. Now, Abiaki was the next Miccosukee leader to come to the forefront of the Seminole War period, but nobody knows him. Nobody knew much about him except during the military aspect of the wars. They would write about him all the time. They called him the devil. He was the one that kept the Seminoles, the Miccosukees that were able to be kept here in Florida. There were no images, there were no descriptions. I have now found 3 and published thereof, and it's really wonderful because we now can talk about that man. And the restrictions on talking about them have been lessened by the tribal councils, so now we can talk about him. He was far more famous than Osceola and actually placed Osceola in a position of leadership which he would not have had otherwise. So let me continue. He did become a legend in his own time for implementing one of the greatest resistant movements in the annals of history. The war leader of the Miccosukee, he was then given the position of Grand War Leader at the head of the Latchuas, Creek refugees, smaller fragmented bands, a number of runaway slaves, and the Indians' own slave force. He and the Miccosukees were responsible for giving a position, as I said, to the young Osceola, who had not been born to a clan that would have allowed him to lead. So we would not know a thing about him had it not been for the Miccosukees placing him in a position. Jones's credo and determination was to resist America's genocidal relocation efforts at all costs in order to keep the people here in Florida on the land, their actual religious place on Ekanuksha, to assure the future existence of the Miccosukee, the Illipanati. So powerful was this man that long after his life ended in 1866, his laws remained substantiated and in practice, enforced by the old men, the councilmen, who were charged with keeping social order, which included the use of capital punishment. These virtually unchallengeable laws were for the most part upheld until the advent of federal tribalism in the latter 1950s. Thus, the name of Abiaka, or Sam Jones, was ingrained in the daily lives of the elders during the 50 years of war and uncertainty. But for many post-war traditionalists, his was a name which was not directly spoken due to fear of his great spiritual power, even in death, as was the Miccosukee tradition. This vegetation map for 1947 provides the most accurate illustration of the Everglades and Big Cypress. Basically, what you see here is as it was in Sam Jones's wartime domain. The same water roads, the same island complexes before the widespread wholesale damage of the Everglades shortly after 1947 from invasive water conservation areas and widespread cattle and agricultural interests. Remembering also that those high settlement islands on both sides of the Everglades that Jones made newsworthy before and during the Seminole War. And we know one. Has anybody been out to Pine Island at the park? Yes? Yes. I saved that island, actually. I happened to have my research done at the time it was coming up for Sea Ranch Lakes development, and we were able to get it saved out to the drip line. So that was a very great coup. It was the first major settlement of Seminole note to be saved. There were also islands that stretched across the Big Cypress to the Atlantic Ridge that also still exist today in the Everglades. And we've saved so far 3 of the eastern islands in the complex of Pine Island from development. And do me that favor of going out to Pine Island. Last time I was out there, I was with a digital producer from PBS Boston, and we'll be supplying her with maps and so forth to go along with some projects that she's been working on Pine Island and Sam Jones as his settlement. But this is really important because it's such, Pine Island Ridge is between State Road 84 and Orange Avenue. But you can't get to it from Orange, you have to go around. But it's a Broward County Park, so you'll look it up online and be able to get there. But it's remarkable. There are horses that are almost always out there because there's horse trails, but I walked it barefoot back about 2 years ago with my son, who had been this big last time he was there and didn't remember it. And I said, Forget that, we're going out there, so we walked it. It's great. Up and down. It's the highest point in Broward County. It's 29 feet high. You get nosebleed. Nosebleed. I went out there with the reporter once, and he said, well, when are we going to get there? And I said, oh, we're there. Now we're going to take a look at the Miccosukee Habitat, the Ilapanathi as a people living off the land and the ecosystem of the Everglades, where the pre-war Miccosukee had lived and where today's small Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida continue to live down off the Tamiami Trail. Seasonal fires from lightning strikes were part of the seasonal ecology of the Everglades. It clears it all out, makes it clean. This is the name of the seasonal drought, which you could say we'll be having now, called Ochakachea, which means water all gone. And when the fires burned off large areas during the drought, it did indeed serve to cleanse the area of debris and pathogens for a fresh, clean start in the spring. These butterworts denote a shallow slough, and with a heavy season of rain, it might even fill enough to be a canoe trail. Across the Everglades in the Big Cypress area is a historical inland waterway, the Okaloakuchi Slough. This was Sam Jones's wartime secret weapon. The slough allowed him undetected access to and from the Florida uplands, creating and aiding in his wartime mystique as a formidable medicine man. However, in the slough, there was strategic in enabling his port and supply line north with valuable goods for the war effort. And it was gathered from shipwrecks right here at the end of Sheridan Street. In 1838, there were about 9 major wrecks with good stuff on them, including some lead for shot. And he would take that stuff and run it up as far as Jupiter. One of the ships was called the Lovely Ezekiah, and we found the logbook up at Jupiter. So the Okaloakuchi Slough allowed that man to literally run supplies before rum running. The Devil's Garden at the top on the right corner was an area that's been recently designated to commemorate Jones. The enlisted men and others from the military often referred to Jones as the devil. There's been poems, songs, etc. And this area of the Big Cypress has long been associated with Jones and his farms. It wasn't far from his 24-foot-high island settlement, and the area has been planted frequently during the war, and the locals have associated this area with Jones forever after. In 2016, Chairman James E. Billy received state approval to designate County Road 833 as the Sam Jones Trail. The names of the family camps seen are from the latter 1920s, and they represent clan families that had long repopulated the slough when this map was included in a federal report on the Seminole warfare in the 1930s. Now this map is really a goodie because it shows the Everglades from the Atlantic coast. It's a historical composite of then and now by David M. Blackard, and it illustrates the New River, Fort Lauderdale area south to Upper Biscayne Bay. The gray is former Everglades, the white is dry land. Would it help if we had the lights off? Yes. Could somebody turn the lights off, please? It's just the color, it doesn't show up as well. Pine Island, you can see there up at the top, that upside down thing. 6 miles southeast of Pine Island is Chivos Island, another one that my research saved. And it was occupied at the same time, and it was occupied also, we know by documentation, in the 1820s. You see, nobody wanted to go into the Everglades. It was really a freaky place to them. They thought they might fall off the earth, I'm sure, or something. But they really didn't go in until the Seminole Wars in the 1840s. So, well, actually in the 1830s they made a couple of forays too, but that's where the Miccosukee say they have lived forever, and I believe that because they were in the interior of Florida. Florida's earlier Indians were around the perimeter. And the Miccosukees religiously, and I mean that literally, swept their camps every morning. So what's left to find if you're an archaeologist? Nada. Nothing to find. They swept the islands to the south where the waters were flowing from Okeechobee and the islands were all striated, and there's nothing left. So I think that's why archaeologists can't pinpoint when they came to the Everglades. At any rate, also I must add on that note that they were not pushed into the Everglades as every book, popular and scholarly, on the Seminoles said. During the Seminole Wars, they were not pushed into the Everglades. That's where they had lived and continued to live. All of these islands figured historically in a continuous post-World War settlement pattern, and most of my family's Miccosukee friends' parents and grandparents were born there. It was, and again, it was the old real estate mantra, location, location, location. And it included dual seasonal residency in the Big Cypress for pursuing seasonal hunting and gathering exploits, most especially the lucrative salvage of shipwrecks along the Atlantic beaches. I mean, my family did it. All other families that were here in the 1880s did it. Frank Stranahan, blah, blah, blah. And all the Seminoles continued to do it up until that time. Let's see. I do believe that during the Seminole Wars, had there not been wrecking and had those ships not been wrecked right off of the inlet that was then in Hollywood, the Fort Lauderdale Inlet, I don't think they could have kept this war going as long as they did, and we might not have the history that I've been relating to you. Pine Island, Long Key, and Chivos Island are preserved today. And they were preserved actually by presidential decree in 1911, but it just wasn't followed through. This is Pine Island, the way I saw it by plane one day when I was coming home from Tallahassee with the records in my suitcase. And it looked just like this, minus some of the houses, but there's Pine Island. It's still there because it's hard to incorporate a 20-something foot mound in a subdivision. So we were really glad that we got them to go at least to the drip line. And if we'd had all the information that I have now, we would have made them go away farther from the drip line because they're pretty close. You'll be walking close to a bunch of houses, but you have every right to do so when you visit. This is one of Pine Island's 3 settlements circa 1895. And the Pine Island is an anomaly in the flatlands, lowlands of Florida. And it is the highest point in Broward County. And it was left not as a mound like Indians would mound it up. It was actually left when the ocean waters receded from the landmass of Florida. So it's very unique. The Miccosukee culture in a camp like this is matrilineal. Everybody there would have been of a clan. Except for the husbands, who were of other clans, because that would have been considered incest to marry somebody of your own clan. So that was the structure of the families. And it was matrilineal, meaning the women are in charge. They were the ones that determined, like, say, to go to town to the tourist attractions later on. They were the ones that determined when they go off to Big Cypress and camp or whatever. And the children were all in allegiance to the mother's clan, her family. The men would go home to their own families if they were divorced or otherwise. And the Miccosukee clans are panther, bird, wind, otter, big towns, bear, snake, and hare. I'm leaving deer out because the deer are Creek. At Pine Island, again in 1895, is a typical settlement of Chickees with the sleeping or work platform covered by a roof of sable palm fan thatch. It would last about a decade with no overhanging vegetation to compromise it. And this is actually made into a postcard. Back before Hollywood was Hollywood, this was a postcard of our area. A deciding factor in the initial state purchase of a Seminole site through Carl funding was this visual of Pine Island's ceremonial grounds. In the spring green corn dance and the fall hunting dance, they would be held on this site until around 1900, when a Fort Lauderdale pioneer, William Bryan, purchased the land for his farming interests on the newly drained Everglades mucklands surrounding the island. In the wake of drainage canals north and south of the 2.5-mile long island, coupled with the invasive farming project, The Miccosukee abandoned their historical generational home site. The Bird Clan family of Sally Willie, husband Charlie Willie, Big Towns, moved far into the Everglades to an island north of the future Tamiami Trail. Other Pine Island families, such as Annie Tommy's family, and I'm sure some of you have heard of Annie, they moved from Big City Island to near Fort Lauderdale on Broward Boulevard. And of course, we were talking about Ivy Stranahan earlier in Stranahan House. I heard somebody mention that. Annie was a person that was very close to Frank and Ivy Stranahan. The shortages of the Seminole War behind them, the fluent economy of the men's hide market, and the women's own income from Everglades products such as seasonal huckleberries, Everglades honey, and their hogs, the post-war women of Pine Island, heading up the three clans, dressed in fine calicos of dark blue and turkey red, and wore Italian glass seed beads, necklace beads, purchased from William Brickell, Miami River Trading Post, and Frank Stranahan's on New River. Their brooches were made by Miccosukee silversmiths out of silver coins beaten thin, which they stitched onto their bodices. The major post-war Miccosukee living in the Everglades continued utilizing their major transportation, the Cypress Dugout canoe, well into the 20th century, when not impeded by drainage canals. This is Charlie Cypress, who with his Otter Clan brothers were noted canoe makers. The tool in his hand is an axe called a tlishinoget, translated cuts it out. A cypress tree's cut allowed to season and hewn with the aid of a charring process with coals. It's then pared down. Eventually those same holes are bored through the husk, and then they're plugged with cypress, and when it is in the water, the plug swells and makes it watertight. But it's a great way to see how you're going in the canoe making process. In 1908, widower Robert Osceola, a close friend of my great-grandfather Freeman's, had a camp and landing located up North Fork of New River in Fort Lauderdale. His Big Town Clan sons, William McKinley, Corey, and John, would become major participants in Miami's Seminole Indian Village venues from the 1920s. And they would build their own wives, small attractions along the future Trans-Everglades Highway, the Tamiami Trail, in 1928 when it opened. Robert and his sons were often at my Freeman family home in the 1880s and 1890s, where they took part in special events such as birthdays and Christmas parties. My great-grandfather carved and fitted steps for some of the Miccosukee sailing canoes for the masts. In 1904, a large canoe from the North Fork of the Miami River is going into the narrower South Fork with its burlap feed sack sails taken down and stowed. As the canoes have no keel, they can't support a thick canvas sail, or it would turn right over. And this is a woman fleeing from the Dimmock Everglades expedition in 1910 near Big Cypress. Not only was the rancor of the Miccosukee towards the government still viable, there were council-made and enforced laws against talking too much or even speaking with whites that made it prudent to make a quick getaway from strangers. Of course, this policy didn't carry over into the established friendships, which were often genuine and lifelong. This image shows the unique boot on the distal end of the push pole. Do you see that? It's kind of a triangular looking thing. It was an innovation. We don't know where it came from. It's been with Miccosukee canoers all the time that we know of, so it's probably very old. And this was to keep the pole. If it had just been a regular pole with no boot on the end, it would have stuck in the mud overlying the oolitic limestone in the Everglades or in even some shallower areas. So this made it perfect for Everglades travel and was obviously adapted. Miccosukee man sails his canoe off Biscayne Bay at Commodore Ralph Monroe's estate, the Barnacle. Has anybody been there? It's a wonderful house, wonderful, fantastic. You should go. The family was friends of ours, and it's just so wonderful to know that it's been preserved. So it's a state site in Coconut Grove. The water trails in the Everglades and Big Cypress were centuries old. Some had been purposefully cut, like this one. And this picture was made in the early 60s. elongated cypress heads, like I said, all the islands, whether they're wet or dry, flow from north to south because the waters of Lake Okeechobee carved them in that way. Sometimes, though, they're a mile long, so if you were in a canoe, you'd have to go a mile out of your way to get to the other side. So to facilitate getting on the other side without doing that, either the earlier Calusa people in this area or the Miccosukee themselves carved a canal. Let's call it a canal. This camp is on an island in the Big Cypress that's only 12 to 14 feet above the water. The diagonal braces that you see on the Chickee are evidence of a recent hurricane. That's how they would brace them for a hurricane. And not even 12 out of the water. This is about 3 feet out of the water. This is lower in the Everglades. Mrs. Smallpox Tommy, Mary Tommy's bird-clanned island home, was in the southern Everglades near the Tamiami Trail. In comparison to the previous island, this is indeed a low-lying, only a few feet above water, but still quite inhabitable. This aerial view is made from the 1929, shows the traditional camp layout, including the central cooking chickee, hog pen, and 3 canoe landings with docks. The islands in this area, as I mentioned before, were striated north to south, shaped by the constant southward flowing waters that fed the Everglades from Lake Okeechobee in its natural state. This is a very unusual photo, though, for me. It's been able to be annotated. It was taken by the Miami photographer, a society photographer actually, Claude C. Matlack, from the Goodyear blimp Defender in 1929. Also on board the Defender was Corey Osceola, that was born up near my house in Fort Lauderdale, and other men from the Musa Isle tourist attraction. They were looking down at Mrs. Smallpox Tommy's camp for the first time in their lives with great interest. Meanwhile, Mrs. Smallpox Tommy was scared out of her mind and was staring up at this thing coming at her. And you know how the blimp goes, So she was petrified. And she told the Miami News later, when she was an older woman, she had not forgotten it. She said she saw that huge flying thing as it came towards her camp, and she ran to her banana patch, which is right over there, and hid until dark. So it's very seldom that we actually get a real annotation going on a photograph. That was great. In 1904, these men in a camp in Big Cypress are cutting cheeky posts with a cross-cut saw, the same kind my great-granddad used around 1905. And you can note the early beginnings of patchwork clothing on the man on the right. These are draw knives for skinning the cheeky posts and saplings. It takes the bark off. The bark's where the insects hide, so you need to get that off. There was work for everyone of every age, especially in a cheeky thatching job. This elderly man tacks a nail into a palmetto fan ready for another worker up on the roof to take. And as the fan is twisted and the stem is nailed onto the frame, the closeness of the stems determines the quality of the job, hence the longevity of the thatch. And I've been told this is a good job if they're that close. So if you have any chickees built, check it. The result is a work of art. Larger chickees like this one are built with a vent to exit the hot air that rises to the peak. And no matter what the heat of the day, it's always cooler sitting on the raised platform under the thatch. It's really amazing. I really need to put a thermometer outside the chickee and in the chickee, because people go under it and they go, oh my. So it really is quite different. A bit on traditional foods. This sand dune burrowing land tortoise, the gopher turtle that lives in that hole, is a delicacy found on the high Florida scrub pine lands where huckleberries, a type of blueberry, is also grown. And you won't see much of this, I'm afraid, because it's all gone, but we used to hunt huckleberries during the season. It's just part of our life, and make huckleberry pies. But they're like a blueberry, really. This is a 21-inch long, 13-inch wide soft-shell turtle, and they do grow bigger. But I hauled this one off the road of 575 one day and dumped him in the Caloosahatchee River. He was going to get squashed. But you can see that a turtle this size, like during the war when everybody was, fleeing or finding hiding, and they could easily get a turtle like this, turn it upside down over a fire. Mind you, they'd lost all their utensils, right? Nothing, they had nothing. But if you turn this upside down in its shell and cook it like they did, you'd have a meal for a number of people. So it's just being resourceful with what you've got. And likewise, this is the alligator snapping turtle, and I've picked a baby one this big up off of Snake Road going to teach one day, and the darn thing turned his head around trying to bite me. They are very mean. So you need to leave them alone, but my friends all told me, about the softshell. Why didn't you bring that to me? Because we know what they would have done with it. But this is a big one, and Jimmy O'Toole, my friend, Miccosukee, took that picture. Fishing and also harpooning manatee were usually done from a canoe, and this area of New River, right near the Stranahan Trading Post actually, was a great site. The water was just right, the movement of the water coming around, the bend was good. And there was also a huge manatee kill site in the Shark River area on the coast that was used by Miccosukee as well from very early times. This is Dr. Tommy, Annie Tommy's husband, gigging off the Stranahan dock, gigging probably garfish. And these are, where did that go? Huh. Those are the gar, and that's weird. Picture sometimes jumps out even though it's made from the site. Anyway, these are garfish, roasting on a grill. The gar is a very interesting fish because it's like armored. It's like very old, I believe. It's considered trash by most non-Indian anglers. The gar are grilled on one side, then turned over and grilled on that side. And when they're fully cooked, they're completely rigid. And so what you do is pick them up by the tail and whack them on the side of the table. Breaks open, literally breaks open. Beautiful white meat inside. Flaky white meat, very, very good. But this is how we do at the Seminole Family Camp. We cook them this way sometimes for Seminole Fair, which is coming up, and I will make note of that to you. I hope it's not on the same weekend, but I think it is, as your festival. The Miccosukee would select a lush hammock for their agriculture. And again, these people out in the Everglades, and they're doing everything as simply and perfectly as they can to get the required result. This was the most efficient way to grow crops on the Everglades Islands. You girdle the trees, and that's that black line going horizontally at the base of the trees. You girdle the tree with an axe, and that kills the trees. And their leaves drop to the ground and further enrich the soil. And then you plant at the bottom the Seminole pumpkin. And the pumpkins grow up the trees and hang down. And when you wanted a pumpkin, you were the mom, you'd tell the kid, go out and shoot me down some pumpkins. They loved it. But that's what it would be used for. That would keep them up out of the wet, when we have our wet seasons, keep them up out of the few cattle that they had, and was the best way to grow them. And these are the pumpkins. I had never seen any, and most everybody I know had never seen any. But this was in a rotogravure section of the Miami News from 1930s. And this is it. It's called a Chasahawitsa, and there's actually a town, that means hanging pumpkins. The town is over, I think it's north of Tampa. But this is the squash. It's an actual squash, as many pumpkins are. This, of course, you recognize. This is Kunti. This is Zamia floridiana, and the natives, we call it Kumpti. And that's what all the pioneer families in Miami, anyway, used as their first cash crop. They'd hire men to go out and grub the Kumpti roots, and then they'd bring them in and process them. And then they'd send the flour to Key West by boat. And this is the other Kunti called Kunti Hupki, which means red Kunti, and it's the briar. There's a briar root. Chopping sable palm cabbage for swamp cabbage is similar to an Irish stew, seasoned with meat, and it was another readily available dish that was utilized in war and peace by the Miccosukee. And people are always asking me, what do they do about bugs? What do they do about mosquitoes? Well, we can always use bear grease for mosquitoes, but if you're sitting around the cooking chickee and you don't want to get flies on your food, they would use this. This is their 1920s and 30s, was still being used. This was the fly stick plant. And it grows, I mean, it might have grown here, but I don't remember it very well, even though I was in the woods a lot. But it does grow on the west coast, where there's still woods available, but going fast. But it's the fly stick plant. You cut this and put it on your platform near the food, and the flies stick to it and leave the food alone. So that was a fortunate thing. This is Mammy Jumper, Aunt Tommy's mom. She was Panther Clan and photographed at her Coontie preparation area on the North Fork of New River. It's very near where I have lived all my life. Her Coontie grater looks like my great-grandmother's nutmeg grater, much bigger, of course, and it rests against the barrel on the right. The graters were made of tin from the wrecks again out on the beach. Nails were driven through, and where the prongs where the nails went through, that was the grater part. So it was really used just like your grandma's nutmeg grater. And they grated the Coontie roots on that in the processing. And a bit more on wrecking. Wrecking was an actual British industry in the Bahamas, and most post-war Seminoles operated, and post-Seminole Wars was operated professionally by the Americans out of Key West. So if a man was here and they saw a wreck out on the beach, the first person to it was the wrecking master. He'd get the largest share of the money when it was sold in Key West. And then it would go gradually down the line from there. If another ship pulled up, fine. And they try to get the ship down to Key West. If they couldn't, they'd take the goods off. They'd always take people off first, of course. And all the families from Pine Island participated in wrecking until we all stopped. This is 1904 in the Big Cypress. The man on the left carries the haunch of a deer on his back easily with the aid of a burden strap across his chest. Venison remained a major source of protein. And you can note again, the patchwork is coming into the clothing in the sense that the clothing is being layered with different colors of material and calico. On the left is a pile of tanned hides with the hair left on. And this would be ready to go to the trading post, and it had been made into probably buckskin on the inside. It had been cleaned by the women. This is Frank at the Stranahan Trading Post in the 1890s. And Sally Willie's Bird Clan sons are out in 1904 with goods from a successful day at a trading post, probably on the Miami River. At that time, they had left Fort Lauderdale. And this is Will Stranahan, Frank's brother, with an otter shingle. The otter hide's been cased or removed whole. That means you start with the mouth, pull it over the head, and go on down the body to the tail. Normally, this is done by the Miccosukee by hanging the otter so that gravity has some help in the pull from the woman. It's the woman's job to do that. Let's see. And then once you get it off, it's turned wrong side out, so the fur's on the inside. This is the hide on the outside. And it's let to cure that way and just get hard. The hide gets hard. And then you pull it off that shingle, which is a board that it's on, and you can stack those, tie them up, and put them into a canoe to go off to the trading post. And you could put a lot of those in a canoe when they're done that way. Again, it's the ease of it all. This is circa 1900 downtown Miami at Brickell's Trading Post at the mouth of the Miami River with Biscayne Bay in the background. And Seminole hunters around 1917 guiding white hunters in the Everglades, which was another means of actually cash for them. Abraham Lincoln Clay of the Panther Clan around 1920 poses for the small alligator. Alligators were sold by the foot, and by 1930 it was estimated that hunting still accounted for 66% of a Seminole family's income. And again, note here, we've got a new style of pierce strip patchwork clothing and an even earlier band of machine sewn patchwork. So the Up on the bodice, down the front and along his belt, is the applique patchwork, and the machine sewn patchwork is on the, as we could call it, skirt. This is a postcard of the head of the Miami River. It was only 4.5 miles long. It was a little dinky river, but it flowed really hard out of the Everglades. And this was taken from the Sally or Everglades Tower that was an early tourist attraction. You climbed to the top of the tower and looked down on the Everglades, and they'd tell you, can you imagine when this is all drained and we can put our crops out there? And that had been going on since 1845. This is a dredge on the river in Fort Lauderdale. Sam Huff of the Panther Clan recalled that steam shovels began to make canals in the Everglades, and this was for draining the Everglades for those farms everybody wanted. Steam shovels came out of Fort Lauderdale and others came out of Deerfield, heading for Okeechobee. And this was a quote, "Just as soon as they hit the lake, the water's going to dry up in those Everglades, and as soon as the water dries up, they're going to plant plantations." That's what the white people said to the Indians. Another steam shovel went from Dania and another one from Miami. Just as soon as they hit Okeechobee, the water was going to dry up. But I didn't believe it, Sam said. I didn't believe it until they hit Okeechobee. Then the water dried up, and even in Okeechobee it was dry too. The Everglades became small, and the trees grew very fast. And that was a friend of mine that interviewed him in 1956. Another postcard applauds the engineering feat of drainage, depicting one of the infinity canals to or from Okeechobee. While the canals also impaired canoe travel to Miami and the Lower East Coast, the Miccosukee's main trading post area. The seasonal activities, gathering, visiting patterns, and innumerable other folkways were soon curtailed, altered, or lost for all time for the Miccosukee. Again, this is Claude Matlack, the society photographer. He championed the Miccosukee, taking a series of poignant photographs along the Tamiami Trail and commercial publicity sets in the Seminole Indian village tourist attractions in Miami around 1921. This photo is from the Spoilbank roadway of the Tamiami Trail, State Highway 41, looking across the Tamiami Canal. Excuse me, water break. In the Miccosukee matrilocal camp of the Jack Tigertail family Wind Clan, during the severe cold spell in around 1917, they wanted to go from their area of another Pine Island, an island that's down around Homestead. They wanted to go to the river where they could keep warm, the Miami River. So every year thereafter, they went there, they went back, and eventually the Coppinger family, with a Seminole attraction, invited them to come and build houses and stay there for the winter season, which was only 3 months then, January through March, and they did. This is Coppinger's brochure. It was a dream of Father Henry, who was a botanist who had landscaped Henry Flagler's hotels in Miami and 2 in Nassau, and was a really good friend of David Fairchild, the botanist. In this natural hammock, the Cappingers built their own house and set up their Indian village. And many of the tourists who came to Coppingers arrived hourly from Miami's bayfront on a tour boat called Dixie. Again, Jack Tigertail, in 1921, posing in a studio that made him the most famous Miccosukee in Miami's tourism market, pointing the way to the proposed new town of Hialeah, High Prairie in Miccosukee, that was to be built on drained Everglades land. Actually, it's very funny because it was so low in Hialeah, because it had been Everglades, that when they had a flood, the Seminoles had to come back and ferry people to and from in their canoes. The cars were stranded in the driveways, so to speak. And this is the 32-foot eye-catching signboard of Jack Tigertail advertising Hialeah at the entrance to the new subdivision but another was posted at the Georgia-Florida state line on Highway US 1. The Seminole Village tourist attraction venues became the perfect match for Miccosukee's reticence and traditions, the protection and advancement of native sovereignty, on-the-job training, and the attractions venues created a fostering and renaissance in tribal arts, especially patchwork. Even with the rigid mores of the traditional Miccosukee Council, the attractions became the Miccosukee's best bet for keeping abreast of the distrusted U.S. government, to counter any potential shenanigans from Uncle Sam or other individuals that could threaten the sovereignty of these never-defeated people. Of course, their newsworthy moniker via the press was the Unconquered Seminoles. They didn't care that they knew they were Ilipanathi. That's all they needed to know. So they never put themselves forth and said, hey, we are not Seminoles. They just didn't bother. They just took the income and were happy to have what they had. And they also were called the descendants of the only enemy that Uncle Sam has never failed to conquer. So they had good credentials that way, to be very tourist quality. No one knew that this ethnic majority of Florida's Indian population were native, though, and that's why we still don't know that. I mean, nobody, it's not a popular concept. But they first realized in 1936 that they wanted to help these people. They wanted to give them reservations, they wanted to do this and do that. And the Miccosukees' reply to them was, just leave us alone. That's all they wanted. That is rather their mantra. There were 2 cooking chickees at Musa Isle, as the women of different clans never cooked over the same fire. Traditionally, at every green corn dance in May to June, the old fires are extinguished. The medicine man then strikes a new fire, and the women take it back to their camps. The Miccosukees' fires were never allowed to be extinguished, and with the way the fires are laid, with 4 huge logs forming the ceremonial base, then kindling of various sizes goes in between, and it fairly assures that the fire is indeed always viable. And like I mentioned, they did carry those coals wherever they went. This is Charlie Willie that we've mentioned before, and he was the head of the tourist attraction at Musa Isle. Do you need me to go farther? Do I need to quit? Hello? Do I need to quit? Am I okay time-wise? Okay. This is Corey Robert Osceola, born on Pine Island of the Big Towns clan, and he was the next head to Musa Isle. He poses here with Bert Lasher, the manager and the creator of the most popular events. And in the truck is the family of his brother, Corey's brother, John, who had just come in from the Tamiami Trail because they operated both, the Tamiami Trail villages, and then they'd come in to get the benefits of tourism. These were the reservations in that day. We have the tiny little bit at Hollywood there that you can see. And has everybody seen the building? Okay, the large, huge guitar that we're not allowed to say, but it's the Les Paul guitar. We aren't supposed to say that because that's actually copyrighted, but that's what it was conceived as. And I like that somehow. I think it's a great tribute. But you can see the other reservations, the large state and federal reservation in Big Cypress. And then the third reservation that was gotten for the people was in 1938. And the reason that that large reservation is up at Brighton is because the government didn't realize, after all those years of saying, what can we do for you, yada, 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 that there's a separate group of Indians that live here in Florida, and they are called the Creeks. And they had been roaming around Lake Okeechobee area forever, being shunned by the Miccosukee speakers because they were those other people. They didn't have a reservation of their own. The government never gave them a reservation where they could live because they speak a completely unintelligible language. And so that's what that is. That's the Brighton Reservation. They are part of the Seminole tribe of Florida, which they shouldn't have been. They should have been a separate tribe, but they are part of the Seminole tribe of Florida. And that generally is okay. But that was one reason the Miccosukee formed their own tribe, was because they didn't want to be put in with the Creeks. So the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida made their own tribe. This is William McKinley's Osceola's wife and son at Musa Isle. This is a traditional baby hammock. And what seems odd to me is that nobody bothered, no anthropologists except Francis Dinsmore, who was an ethnomusicologist. Nobody went to Miami where they could stay in a nice hotel or motel or whatever and visit the Miccosukee people that were living in the tourist attractions. They thought they were commercial, yada yada, whatever. They were the most traditional people in existence. They and others like them, but these people were accessible. You didn't have to go into the Everglades and brave the Miccosukee, the mosquitoes. You could just stay right in Miami and do all the research you wanted, but nobody did. Not anyone. And also at the tourist attractions, like I said, patchwork saw a renaissance. The women didn't have to go run after their hogs and castrate them and whatever. They could sit around making patchwork. This was early cultural tourism, 30 years before it was ever invented and appropriate for tribal peoples the world over. Cultural tourism, I always said that the book that I wrote on this particular period couldn't have been written any earlier than it was, because the government wanted you to know, all of you, government right from here, the Seminole tribal headquarters, that this was the worst thing that these people could possibly do. And Deaconess Harriet Bedell out on the Tamiami Trail said they were exhibited like monkeys and alligators. These people did not believe that. That's not how they felt at all. They were innocent. They were making money. They were learning how to read and write. They were doing all the things that they needed without being forced or put in a boarding school someplace in Indian America. The tallest guy on the right, not the one in the middle, is Buffalo Tiger. He became the first chairman of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida in 1962. Where would he have been had he not been raised at Musa Isle? He was also an accomplished artist, but you know, these people were the major craft workers that went out on the trail and made crafts. It was a wonderful environment for them, and I fortunately was able to interview those people before they passed.
Where is Musa Isle?
Musa Isle was on the Miami River. Sorry, I didn't get that. It was on the Miami River. I can't think the street. Not there anymore, of course. It's a condo complex. Don't you know? Of course. So when I came along, I met the grandchildren of the people that were on Pine Island. And those grandchildren, including Corey Osceola and all those, his brothers and all of them, then went to Musa Isle. I mean, that was the next thing they did. And this was only seasonal. They didn't have to be there. At this particular place, this was at Coppinger's, and he rented upright sewing machines for people to use, gave them cloth, you know, all kinds of concessions for them being there in the camp. It was terrific. And the sewing machines, my great-granddad sold sewing machines uprights from Montgomery Ward because the family had come in 1887 from Illinois, and he was earlier than Sears, Mr. Sears. So Montgomery Ward was selling everything, and the customers write or your money back, because there were a lot of shysters out there that were getting, you know, mail order, you don't know what you're getting, so they'd sell them, quote, a bill of goods. So Montgomery Ward was a real champion in that particular area. So most of the early Seminoles got stuff from my great-grandfather just for the shipping. By the far most popular machine, though, was the little hand crank sewing machine. The women could pick that up, put it right in their canoe, and go on off with it. And one day, a friend of mine, who was a young girl in Miami in the early days, another pioneer family, she said she was going to school and went through one of the hammocks. And you know, a hammock is a tree island, basically. Here was a woman sitting on a huge fallen tree with her little singer sewing. patchwork, right there in the middle of nowhere. So it's really a neat thing, and did really promote patchwork. I just wanted you to see in this early period, like 1917, sort of the colors of the fabric. Now the brown was used at this period, but later it was, you wouldn't see brown at all. There were all kinds of colors, and it was really very beautiful. But this is, when they were just starting to do some patchwork, and they've got the applique there in those little zigzag designs. That's like a mola, where you put one piece of fabric on top of another. You cut the top layer and turn under the design elements, so that what you've got is a design left after you've cut and turned the edges for a sawtooth, let's say, under. So it's just like a mola. And these are men's garments. This is later. This would be like from the late 20s, early 30s. And those are men's garments. Men's garments.
Did you ever wear long trousers?
Yes, that gingham over there on the corner, the pink gingham, checked, the check, that is to tuck into your pants. In other words, it went to the point where they cut this off and put that plain fabric in, so it was easier to tuck into pants, because it's hard to tuck in patchwork, it's lumpy, okay? And then the next step was they would cut the waistband off and it became a jacket. First it was just a loose jacket, and then it became a jacket with a waistband. Now their wares were also sold at the tourist attractions, tourist items, let's say, besides the beautiful clothing. And the jackets became quite popular. We call them presentation jackets, because, for instance, at the opening of Everglades National Park, December 6, 1947, which was the day I was born, so I can remember that easily, President Harry Truman was given a jacket by William McKinley Osceola. So that was some of the start. And Bing Crosby and Pablo Picasso, they all had Seminole jackets. And here's how they are made. This is patchwork. Again, this is graphics by David Blackard. You sew all these colors together, and then you cut them along the dashes on the diagonal. And then you stitch those pieces together, and there you go. This particular kind is very simple. Of course, it also gets more complex. And then you band it, and that's it. The most popular Seminole craft, though, absolutely most popular, what I always consider kept them living, was the Seminole Doll. Okay, who has one? I know that Joan has a really early man, which I want to see. Does anybody have a Seminole Doll? No, my goodness. Oh, that's terrible. Anyway, I'll show you how they're made. This is a woman out getting the palmetto fiber from the sable palmetto bush at this point. It hasn't become a tree yet. And she cuts the fiber. This is what the fiber looks like. I feel, and I've got statistics on it, that next to gaming, the Seminole Doll was the most consistent economy that these people had. And gaming only started in 1979, and that just meant when it started. That wasn't when there was enough cash built up to dividend to families. So the doll has pulled them through some really, really rough times. And this is what the doll's body is made of. And then, of course, patchwork. Lots of times the ladies have people who go get the fiber. So the fiber's gotten, they trade it around, and then somebody else that does the heads, the little round balls for the heads, and puts the embroidery eyes and mouth on it, and then somebody else will make the patchwork. It's not always that way. Sometimes a lady makes the entire thing. But it's kind of a production line sometimes. And when Silver Springs tourist attraction opened up around Ocala, during the tourist season, they simply couldn't keep in dolls. Pillowcases full, they said. They had pillowcases full, but that wasn't enough. And these are some of my dolls that have been given to me, and they were in an exhibition at Society of the Four Arts in Palm Beach. You can see the different styles. The two in the front on the left were repros. They were made to look like some of the old dolls that Judy Bill Osceola made. And alligator wrestling was very, very popular. That probably is what brought people to the tourist attractions more than anything else. Because alligator wrestling, you never knew when that guy was going to get chomped. So this is Cowboy Billy. He was Musa Isle's star wrestler in the 1930s and influenced a lot of people, including James Billy, I think. But it was Henry Coppinger's son, Henry Jr., who first began this. He was the first alligator wrestler. Nobody had ever heard of such a thing. But all the old veteran wrestlers remember that Henry Coppinger was the first, that he taught them. And I interviewed Henry about a year before he passed away. And he was still so enthusiastic. He'd show me how the crowds would just roar when he was out there, you know, wrestling the alligator. He was great. And Howard Osceola said, yeah, we picked it up. We picked it up from him. Everybody wanted to get on that gravy train. But again, this was before they had any other way to make conventional cash, let's say. James Billy recalled that in the 70s, before his election as chairman in 1979, he made an average of $300 a day wrestling alligators. And back then, $300 had the purchasing power of $1,895 today. So James, wow, you know, no wonder he took us all out to dinner every now and then. Musa Isle alligator wrestling hit the big time in this still photo postcard from the early 1930s moving picture Pathé newsreel. So this went all over the country. Everybody knew about alligator wrestling because you remember that in the theaters we had to watch the Pathé first, right? I think I skipped one. Well, anyway, this is John Harvey Kellogg. You all know Kellogg cornflakes, right? Well, this was John Harvey, and he was a judge in a baby contest. And Corey Osceola's wife is sitting over there on the extreme right with a beautiful beaded hairnet, which was popular in 1927. So I would date this 1927. Kellogg had a sanitarium, which did not mean for cuckoos, just a sanitarium like a spa, over on 79th Street. And so during the season, they'd get him to come and judge this contest. And he's holding my dear friend Tahama Osceola, who is a child that was actually given a name in a contest at Musa Isle. So, you know, they had every kind of contest they could think of. Did I skip one? Yes. This was the tourist appeal. There were people standing in the Cheekies to watch this wedding. The government hated it. They really hated the commercial attractions because they constantly showed up the government and the government couldn't do anything about it. I mean, these Indians were celebrating their own sovereignty. They were working on their own, bringing in money, did not need the government, would not ask the government for anything. And that just really rankled the government. While the weddings continued to book the house, also the weddings like Jane Tiger and Jack Motlow, friends of mine that had a wedding and were married forever. So that brought people in as well. After the Trans-Everglades Highway from Tampa to Miami, the Tamiami Trail opened in 1928, the enterprising families, as I mentioned, would move out there. There was actually a phrase called out to the road. They moved out to the road in Miccosukee. And these were little tiny tourist attractions. This is a little boy, Chestnut Billy, over on the right. He was born and raised in the tourist attractions, and he headed up as head man his family's attraction on the trail. And this is up at Silver Springs. Again, this is Charlie Cypress on the left, his wife Lee on the right, and they headed up for Ross Allen, a big village up there at Silver Springs. This is over in Ocala, where Stanley Hansen took a group of people over to the Bach Singing Tower. And Henry Coppinger took people to the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto in 1931. The old councilmen, the people who ran the traditional people, the Sam Jones's teachings, they weren't happy at all. They were really, really upset about that. But the guys knew how much money they'd be making if they went. They got $35 a week per family plus food. And the women had machines. They bought over 100 yards of fabric and spools of thread for the women to make their patchwork there in Canada. They packed chickee posts and chickee thatch so they could build chickees, just like here in Florida, for them to live in. And they took 500 alligators with them. So you can imagine, this was big stuff. This was really big stuff. The Miccosukee participants were indeed a bit apprehensive about this. They were afraid of starving because they were going so far. So Henry packed meat, cheese, 10 loaves of bread, and a crate of canned goods to accompany them, even though they were in first class and they had their own reserved coach car, so they got meals as well. So there was some real well-fed families. By 1932, the well-known but atypically gregarious medicine man Josie Billy was actually promoting the economics of the Seminole Miccosukee activities. But the preservative fear of being sent back to Oklahoma persisted when they were taken out of the state. They were petrified about that. On the bus trip to Canada in 1932 with Alan Davis, this is another trip to Canada, at night they'd pull off to the side of the road in the bus that they were traveling in, and somebody would inevitably look up and go, "Which way's Miami? Which way's home?" And Frank Willie, who was a canoe navigator, he would just point there to the right star, and they knew right where home was, and it made everybody feel better. And this is the entrance to the Seminole Pavilion at the Chicago Exposition in Chicago, 1933, where they stayed for 6 months. Meanwhile, on the reservation, the federal government attempted to provide economic opportunities. The Creeks had asked for a school. They asked the government. They were really on the list because the Miccosukees hated the idea that they would ask the government for anything. But they had always been cattlemen back in the war period, and the Miccosukee themselves received a herd from the U.S. government later on. So this is in Big Cypress. These are Miccosukee working these cows, and they do a great job at it. The tribe is extremely well known for their cattle today and have always been, ever since they've been marketing them. During World War II, with all the men in the cities, black and white, gone to war, the Miccosukee in South Florida, William McKinley Osceola's family, Corey Osceola's family, those men became the foremen for field laborers, and all those people went out and picked the crops that we needed to eat with. Betty Mae Tiger Snake Clan, second from left, was born in Indiantown, Florida. We're dedicating a building, second building, a medical building, on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, to Betty. We already have a building in her name, but this is a huge medical complex right over here on the reservation. And she went away to school because she wanted to read comic books and because she wanted to go into medicine. So she came back as a medical practitioner who was able to work then with a registered nurse. And she and Miss Drury went from Hollywood Reservation down to the trail, up to the lake, all over. And you know it's not easy. There's no real direct routes, and some of the roads back then were just dirt. But they delivered babies, they set arms, they did everything they needed to do, including getting people to hospitals if it was too bad. But she really did her job, and her brother also is depicted there, Howard, who became president of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. And she was nominated and received in 1967 the first chairmanship of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. There's not been another woman that's been elected. This is Betty and her family over at a craft stand that she had her grandfather build for them over at State Road 7 and Sterling Road. This is Howard when he was going into the Marines. There was a low enlistment rate, mainly because, and Native Americans are traditionally warriors. That's the culture they came from. So that's why since 1926, since the First World War, so many Native Americans go to war. This is the only way they can receive true tribal honors, is by doing that. And so as a result, thanks to them, in 1926, Native Americans were made US citizens. Now, some of them, like the Miccosukee, wouldn't have appreciated that if they had known that they were being awarded the citizenship because they still felt very badly against the government. But Howard went to had gone to school, of course, so he could read and write, and that's what I was going to say. For World War II, there were a lot of enlistments, but you had to learn to read and write. And Howard had already gone to school to Cherokee, where Betty had gone, and learned to read and write, so he was eligible to join the military. He was in the Pacific Theater of War. And so was Moses Jumper Sr., who became Betty's husband and was an alligator wrestler. Different jobs for people at this time. There was nothing. The tribe had nothing. No programs, not even the grants that were unsuccessful later in the 70s. So the men wrestled alligators. They were preachers. For the Easter season, the women went out in the woods and got the small bud sprays from the middle of the palmetto stems and would send them to churches all over the U.S. to wave for the Easter services of Palm Sunday. But that's how they made money. That was a big market for them. Even when I remember, that was a big market. And on the Tamiami Trail, the men would boil down the scales of those garfish. The scales are like sequins, and that's what they were made into, was sequins. A stinky old job, but that's what they had to work with. Now this is a picture that I just realized last night is my friend Billy Cypress. Billy Cypress is the one I was telling somebody would actually walk here from the reservation every day because he was a nerd. Billy was like me, always had a book. His wife calls him that too, so I can call him that. But here he was, and he had his little lantern, and that's how he would read. Now these Seminole kids had been sent up to Cherokee school and schools in Oklahoma as well, because integration was coming in and the white schools didn't want to take them and the black schools didn't want to take them, so they were sent out of state to go to school. There was a small school on the res for a while, but it really wasn't successful. So, in order to stay here, the school children were taught to read and write in a very simple way. Some of them didn't go to school till they were 12, and they made up for lost time because they're very smart kids. But Billy went to Stetson University and came home with his degree and was the first director of the Seminole Tribe's Atatuki Museum. But he would walk here to this location, I guess. I mean, I don't think this library's been someplace else, has it? No. So he would walk here every day after school, and that's been noted about him. People thought that was fantastic. But there was no reading, there was no lighting for these kids when they would come home from school. So Mrs. Stranahan from Fort Lauderdale and the Friends of the Seminole Women, which some were here in Hollywood, got together and started a housing project for the families so that they could get a $100 revolving fund so they could take little little tourist cottages up around Pompano, truck them out to the reservation at night, lifting all the wires. I remember this myself. And put those in a little subdivision that they made. And that was the first housing for the reservation, because they were going to be torn down, those little houses, because motels were coming in. And that's how Mrs. Stranahan worked that. So they plumb them, electrify them with that $100 revolving fund, because you see, the Indians don't own their land, the government does. So there was no way they could ever take out a loan to fix their houses. And on the trail, they were out doing frog gigging from handmade World War II surplus airplane engines. This is the early airboats. And it became, of course, airboat rides later on. I'm sorry, I'm going to try to go real fast here. I'm just going to ad-lib here. The tribe in 1953 organized because we had spent so much money in World War II with 2 theaters of war that we needed to make up a deficit, and they decided that it would be the reservations. The Indians would just be mainstreamed, and it was called the Termination Bill. And the Seminoles got together and decided that a lot of them had gone to school, so they were quite capable of deciding things in a committee situation. And they decided that they wanted to form a tribe and be self-sufficient in 25 years, and they led the way with that. And they actually became a tribe and led the way earlier than 25 years. But this is one of their first meetings under the tribal oak. So when you hear the tribal oak, that's what it symbolizes, is where they had those meetings. It's right at the corner of State Road 7 and Sterling. This is down on the trail. The people there were still having little craft shops and supporting themselves and wouldn't have gone with the government for anything in the world. This is Buffalo Tiger again. This is in his later years. He would talk to the groups and talk about water quality and things like that, the changes that he had seen in the Everglades. The government built the Seminole tribe after, condemning them in tourist attractions for so long. They built them one. But unfortunately, by 1962, when this building was erected by Fort Lauderdale architect William Crawford, tourism was out. Disney was starting to come in. It was just not a good time. So this village never really saw it until the cigarettes, tax-free cigarettes came in the 70s. Big stuff, long lines. And then James Billy was elected chairman. 2 tours of duty in Vietnam and Special Forces. Always wanted to do something for his tribe to give them an economic basis. And he signed a contract for bingo in 1979, and it took off. There's the old bingo as it used to be. And the bingo parlor's still there, a bingo parlor on that site today. That was revolutionary. Everybody in town was freaked out, whatever. But it's really helped a lot, and it started gaming. Oops. And this is the office building that was built on a former hog farm on the Seminole Reservation, and they've way, way outgrown that now. This is Betty May Tiger Jumper. I wrote a book on her. I'm sorry I didn't have any copies to bring in. She was marvelous. She spent her whole life doing for the tribe. She would have done anything and did very well, and we're going to dedicate that building to her on Wednesday. And Jack Tigertail is still at work too. He's out there in Billy Swamp Safari showing the way, pointing the way. This is a Tataki Museum, which was a dream of Chairman Billy, but nobody would fund it. The tribe didn't want to fund it. The Florida Humanities Council couldn't fund it. The state didn't, it was one of those things. So he finally got enough money that he and his friend Billy Cypress were able to open a Tataki Museum, and my family helped as well. My children's father was the first director at that museum, and the kids laid glue dirt that I mixed for the exhibits inside.
Where is that?
A Tataki Museum is in Big Cypress. You go out 595 to the Shell Station, I think it is, and go north 17 miles and you'll get there. James had a study done, and it did say that people would come, and indeed from all over the world people have come out there. Again, would be a great trip for the museum, for the society to go out to a Tataki Museum. And Swampwater Cafe is there to feed you at Billy Swamp Safari, where Jack Tigertail was pointing, so you could make a day of it. It'd be really great. So Hard Rock happened, and it was such a major, it caught us all unawares, I think. We were just flabbergasted that the Seminoles would buy Hard Rock. James Billy had been very familiar with Hard Rock Managua in Nicaragua. And in 2004, a deal that he had set in motion purchased the brand. And so now the Seminole tribe owes owns the rank groups Hard Rock International, and they bought it for $965 million. Wow. It was a deal, actually. When I got to Venice, Italy, I always say that because people think I mean Venice, Florida. I don't mean Venice, Florida. The first sign I saw was this one, and I snapped it. This was in 2011, and it was like, yes, my people are here, you know. They're here in Venice. I mean, they say the sun never sets on the Seminole tribes. Sounds like something from England, you know, but the sun never sets on the Seminole tribe of Florida. It's literally all over the world. And they say things like, a former councilman said, we used to survive by hunting the game of the land, and now we survive by gaming in the land. The monthly dividend is $128,000 per year for every man, woman, and child, and they do pay individual income tax. So today, the Seminole and Miccosukee are still in the tourist attraction business. It's been a full 100 years now that they've been in tourist attractions, and at first they could only bet on it, but now they can depend on it. And we see the jack. And what is the jack wearing? Can anybody tell me? Patchwork. Isn't that great? They are very adaptable people, and the Miccosukees rule. And I do want to tell you that Seminole Fair is coming up, and it is the weekend before your event, February 8th through 10th at Hard Rock. You have no excuse. Please go over there. It's, you know, please go over to Seminole Fair. You'll see dancers, plains dancers from out west. It starts usually on Thursday for schools, and then it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But it's a treat. It's a treat for everyone. There's something for everybody. If you like to look at jewelry, there'll be dealers there selling from Oklahoma or at the Southwest. You'll see more Seminoles or Miccosukee in their clothes probably than you'll ever see anyplace else. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. Thank you very much. How do I get out of here?